So back in the project we worked on before, a bit simplified, I dumped the event modifiers, I dumped v1s, and you find this snapshot attached to this lecture in case you also want to start from, well, this state again. So I'm back in this project where we have this input element and the buttons for the counter and so on. Now let's say our goal is to have another button, maybe here below the input, where we say reset input. And the button should do what the name implies. It should reset the input in, well, the input element. For that, we can add a new method, reset input, or however you want to name it. And in there, how do we do that? In there, we now want to clear this input. Now, we could try to get access to the input through JavaScript with document query selector, for example, get access to the input like this, access the value property and set it to an empty string. This might actually work, but it's very hacky. We're not using Vue to then fall back to such explicit JavaScript instructions. That's not the idea behind using Vue. Instead, we want to stay in the Vue world and leverage Vue and its features for that. So, how could we do that? Well, we could use the name data property, which is the value we're ultimately updating on every keystroke, and output it here in input by setting value, the value attribute, equal to name, however, not like this, but instead, since name is dynamic and managed by Vue, with help of vbind. With that, I'm making sure that name is reflected here, so this name here is reflected in the input. Why am I doing that? Well, if I now go to reset input and set this name equal to an empty string, that empty value should be reflected in the input, and we should be able to set it back to an empty string. Now we'll have one problem with that, and that is that in setName, I'm not setting name to just what the user enters, but to what the user enters plus the last name, and that would lead to a strange behavior if we then reflect name back into this input here. I can actually show it to you. If I reload, you'll see if I start typing, Schwarzmuller gets added over and over again, which is not the idea. So for the moment, let's get rid of this last name, which we add here, and let's just store what the user enters with every keystroke in name, and then reflect name back into the input, so that there we really reflect what the user entered. And now let's also connect this button here with vOnClick to this newly added reset input method, so that this is triggered when the reset input button is pressed. And with that, if I now reload, I can enter max here, and it all works, but if I click reset input, we clear that. We also clear it in the paragraph, because there we're referring to the same name which we reset here, but that's just a little side effect here. Of course, if we wanted to prevent that, we could use a separate value which we output here, which we confirm upon hitting enter or anything like that. I showed this before, how we could work with two values, a confirmed input and a regular input, but that's not what this is about. Instead, what this is about the fact that this is a pattern you could need in some occasions. You might have inputs where you don't just want to get the value the user entered, but where you also want to set the value of the input so that you, for example, can reset it with a button or any other logic you have on your page. And you can then achieve this by not just listening to the input, but by also sending the stored value back into the input by binding the value property. This is a common pattern you could need. And actually, it's so common that you need something like this that Vue has a shortcut for this, you could say. It has a special built-in directive which simplifies this. If you bind the value and listen to input changes on input, you can get rid of all of that. So both of the value binding and the input event listening, get rid of both. and instead add a new directive on the input, the vModel directive. And this vModel directive now simply wants the data property it should manage for you. So in our case, the name property. The name property now is managed by Vue such that it's updated on the input event, and the name property's value is then sent back into the input element. So vModel is simply just a shortcut for vBind value and vOnInput. vModel is just a shortcut for this. And if I now save that and reload, we therefore get the same behavior as before, but with less code. And this is a concept called two-way binding, because we're communicating in both ways. We are listening to an event coming out of the input element, you could say, to the input event. And at the same time, we're writing the value back to the input element through its value attribute, through its value property. That's why it's called two-way binding, because we communicate in both directions. And this is useful. It makes getting user input and updating it much easier, as you can tell. It's less code and therefore absolutely a pattern and specifically a directive you should keep in mind. So now it's time to put our newly gained knowledge on events into practice. And for that, attached you find a simple assignment project, some starting styles, empty app.js file, and some content in index.html. And in this index.html file, you also find your assignment instructions. Task number 1 is that you should show an alert when this button here is pressed. Now, the alert can hold any text you want, but the goal simply is to react to this button being pressed and then, well, show the alert. Task number 2 also obviously is related to events, but to a different event. Here, I want you to listen to the keydown event on this input here. And whenever that occurs, I want you to basically update what's showing here in the paragraph. And you should output the value the user entered. So output the user input in this paragraph and update it on every keydown event. Hint, event target value will help you with that. The third task is basically the second task, but with an important difference. I want you to repeat what you did in task number 2, but now only show the user input in the paragraph when the enter key was pressed. These are your tasks. Definitely try them on your own first. In the next video, in the next lecture, you'll see my solution, which you can use to compare it to yours. So, were you successful? Let's solve this together. In task number 1, we should show an alert with any text of our choice when this button is pressed. Now, first of all, we of course need to take control over this section so that we then, in a second step, can add an event listener as we learned it to this button. So therefore, we're going to do something we did many times before already. We're going to create a Vue app. So for that, here in app.js, we simply call Vue create app. We can store that in an extra variable or a constant. We pass our config object to the app. And of course, we want to mount the app and connect it to the HTML code. And here I'll connect it to this section, which already has an ID of assignment. So we can select this with hashtag assignment using a CSS ID selector. Now here on this button, we can use vOn to bind this to an event. And I want to bind this to the click event with vOn:click, and then define the code that should run. And here, as you learned, it's best to add a method. So here we add the methods key to our object config. And this then takes an object full of methods. And now in here, you can add any methods of your choice, or methods with any name of your choice, I should say. And I'll just name it show alert. Sounds like a logical name to me. And in here, I'll then show an alert with the built-in alert JavaScript function. So this is not coming from Vue. That's a built-in function available in vanilla JavaScript and hence also available here in Vue. And I'll just say this works, but of course you can use any text. And now we want to execute show alert when this button is clicked. So here we can point at show alert like this, or alternatively also execute it explicitly, which in this case doesn't really make a difference. But then if it doesn't make a difference, I personally prefer to just point at it since this is closer to vanilla JavaScript. And if we now save that and reload, I can click show alert and I see this works alert. So that's task number 1 solved. Task number 2 is to register the user input on keydown events on this input here and output in the paragraph here what the user entered. And event target value, like before, can help us with that. There's just one special thing about the keydown event, which you'll see in a second. Again, we can use vOn, and now we want to listen to the keydown event, which is another default browser event we can listen to. So a user event the browser is aware of, I should say. And now again, we could execute the code inline here, or better, point at a method that should be executed. And that's what I'll do. I'll add a new method here, name it save input. But again, this method name is up to you. And in here, I want to save whatever the user entered in a value, in a property, in a variable, which I can output in this paragraph. So for that, we need data. Methods allows us to define methods we want to execute, either on our own or implicitly through events. Data allows us to define the data we want to work with in this Vue instance. So here we should return an object, and in here we can then add, let's say, user input or whatever you want as a key, and initially store an empty string in here. And then here in save input, I'll set this user input equal to whatever the user entered, and for that again, since this is a keyboard event on an input element, we can leverage event target by accepting the default event object the browser gives us. Event target then gives us access to the HTML element on which the event occurred, in this case the input, and then this input element has a value property which we can use to read the current value. And with that we set the user input data property with this user input equal to whatever the user entered. Now we just need to point at save input here, and if we now save that and reload, I can enter max here and see nothing because we probably should also output the input here. So here in this paragraph, we use interpolation to output user input. So to output this property and its value. And now if I reload, I can see what I enter. However, you'll notice one thing. There is a delay of 1 keystroke. And the reason for that is that the key down event is fired when the key is pressed, but not yet released. The value in the input here only updates once the key is released, or to be precise, once the key down event is finished. That's why we have 1 keystroke delay here. That's the only reason. But that's not a bug, that's just a key down event, and that's task number 2 solved. Task number 3 was to repeat 2, but only output the entered value if the enter key was pressed inside of this second input. So since we want to repeat what we did before, of course we can copy this first event listener for the key down event and add it on the second input as well. Here I will use the same method. We could also add a new method so that we also, update a different data property, a second one, which we could add on the second input. But here I'll reuse both the user input and the method. But I now want to make sure that the value we output here is only output if the enter key was pressed. And that's actually something I showed you before as well. We can have our confirmed input, which is also an empty string initially. And we can add a new method, for example, confirm input, where I want to set this confirmed input equal to this user input. And then here in this paragraph, with the double curly braces, I output confirmed input. So this new data property, which we're setting here, which I added a few seconds ago. Now confirmed input is output here, and we want to make sure that confirm input, this method, executes when the enter key is pressed in this input field here, in this input element. For that, we can again listen to an event with vOn. In this case, let's say the keyup event, and then use an event modifier with the dot, for example here, the enter key modifier, to make sure that only if the enter key is pressed and released, whatever function we tie to this listener here is executed. So now I point at confirm input here, so at this method. And now this method is only executed if we press a key, but not any key, but the enter key. Now I'm going to restructure this to make it a bit easier to read with my shortcut here in the IDE, but that's the same code I just wrote, just formatted differently to be a bit easier to read. And if we now save that and reload, I can enter max here, and we see it updates in the first paragraph, of course, because there we're outputting user input, not confirmed input. But in the second paragraph, where we do output confirmed input, we see nothing. Only if I hit enter here, only then we output max in the second paragraph as well. And that's the assignment solved. That is all you need to know about events for the moment. With that, let's move on and let's dig deeper into Vue. So now, at this point, we know a couple of things. We learned about DOM interaction, and that's a complex term. With that, I mean that we learned how to make a part of the DOM the template of our Vue app by mounting the Vue app to it. We learned about data binding with vbind and string interpolation, and also vHTML. And we learned about event handling with vOn, but also with vmodel. To be precise, vmodel is two-way binding and therefore the combination of data binding and event handling, so to say. Now it's time to dive into a third big block that makes up Vue. This block has no official name, but I like to call it advanced reactivity. Vue is very reactive. We already see that in a lot of places. When I type here, the name here updates, and Vue does that for us. The same if we change the counter. So that all works. But we have even more features than what we know about thus far. And I want to start by coming back to methods besides using them with events, and then show you a better alternative to methods for certain use cases. Now, in this app here, we added two-way binding, but to add it, we had to get rid of our last name here. Now, that's not too bad, because the way we made the entered name a full name by adding a last name wasn't ideal anyways. Using this setName method, passing in this argument, it worked, but as you see, as soon as you want to do more, for example, adding a reset functionality, it's pretty hard to implement it like this. That's why we had to get rid of it. But that's no problem. We can output a full name here in a different way. For example, we can add a new method. Anywhere where you want, by the way, the order of methods here does not play a role. So I will add it at the top. And I will name it output full name, because that's what this method should do. It should return something, because I'm not going to use it to bind it to an event, but instead I'm going to use it to call it here in the curly braces. I want to call output full name like this. And therefore I want to get back the full name here, which then will be inserted in this part of the HTML code. And therefore here I want to return this name, which is the entered name. So this name property, which we're managing with vModel, plus a blank space, plus Schwarzmüller. And of course, this Schwarzmüller could also be fetched from another input. Here, it's simply hard-coded. And if I now save that and reload, we see Schwarzmüller here at the beginning. And if I enter Maximilian, we see Maximilian Schwarzmüller. Now, since I'm using a method, we can even add an if check and check if this name is currently empty. And if it is empty, we just return an empty string here so that we only add Schwarzmüller if the name is not empty. So here we leverage the fact that we're having a method to return different values based on different values in name. And with that, if I save this and reload, we make sure that we initially don't see anything and we only see full name with Schwarzmüller included if I did enter a real name. And as soon as that's empty again, the full name is gone. So that's pretty nice. However, it's not the best way of doing that. Now, why is that not the best way of doing it? Well, if I type here, we update the name and output it down there. That's good. The problem is, if I press this counter button, we don't see a problem, but behind the scenes, Vue does something which is not ideal. When we change the counter, Vue basically tries to find out where on this page it needs to update the rendered page. So for example, if the counter changes, Vue sees that in this paragraph we're using the counter and hence it needs to, well, update this part here on the real page. That's exactly why we use Vue. It updates the page for us automatically. The problem is, if we call a method like this here, this method will also be re-executed by Vue whenever anything on the page changes, because Vue can't know what this method does. It doesn't know whether maybe the counter gets used in there. Well, if the counter changed and this method maybe uses the counter, this method should be re-executed, right? Well, and for that reason, Vue goes ahead and re-executes any method you're using anywhere in your HTML code between curly braces or with vbind or with vhtml. So any non-event bound method will be re-executed by Vue whenever anything on the screen changes. Even if, like in this case, we know that in this method we're not using the counter. We know it, but Vue doesn't. And from a performance perspective, that's not so great. And we can see this, by the way. We can add a console log here, running again. And if I now increase this a little bit, open up the browser developer tools and go to the JavaScript console part, you will see that if I reload here, we see running again initially. But if I change the counter, we also see running again being executed over and over again, even though we just changed the counter. Still, output full name was executed again for the reasons I just specified. And that's not a bug, that's how Vue works. And that's why methods are not the best solution for outputting some dynamically calculated value like this. But what is a better solution then? Well, you could, of course, put your code in here. Name plus Schwarzmüller, for example. You could put it in here. And if you do that, you avoid this problem. Now Vue is able to see what's getting used here, and it will only update this paragraph and only re-evaluate it if, well, in this case, name changed. And output full name is never called and therefore will never be called by Vue. But now we have more logic in our HTML code, and that's again not good, as you learned. So there is a third nice feature we can use: computed properties. Computed properties are essentially like methods with one important difference. Vue will be aware of their dependencies and only re-execute them if one of the dependencies changed. Computed is the third big configuration option we learn about for the app we created. The first one was data, the second one was methods, the third one is computed. You can add it anywhere in this config object. Here I will add it between data and methods, but the position doesn't matter. So you add computed here, and just like methods and data, this is not a name you can choose. That is a name you have to use because it's one of the key options supported by Vue in Vue apps. Computed, like methods, wants an object. So you pass an object as a value to computed. And now in computed, you define a bunch of methods, just like in methods. But the methods you define in computed will be called and executed differently. That's why we have these two different blocks. So here we could add a full name method, and I'm naming it full name and not output full name, even though I could, because that name is up to you. But I'm naming it like this because we're going to use this like a data property, not like a method. Even though technically it is a method, but we're not going to use it as such, we're not going to call it, and therefore you should name your computed properties just as you would name your data properties. And now in here, we want to return the value that eventually should be yielded by that computed property. And there I'll just copy the exact same code I had in my output full name method. So I'll copy that code and put that in there. And now, as I mentioned, we can use this full name computed property in our HTML code like this. And that's important, not like this, without parentheses. You don't call it, you just point at it and Vue will call it for you. We use it just like we use data properties like the counter here. And that's why we should also name our computed properties like data properties, because we use them like properties, like variables. We don't use them like functions. So full name here will be connected to this full name computed property. So the name, of course, has to be equal. And now Vue will execute this for you. It will basically check if there is a full name data property. And if there isn't, it will check if there maybe is a computed property with that name. And if that's the case, it will execute it. And hence, if I save this here and reload, we see nothing here initially. But as soon as I start typing, we see the full name show up again. So we got the same behavior as before, but now with one important difference. Let's check the developer tools again. In there, if I reload, you will notice running again once initially. Of course, because it needs to evaluate the value returned by full name when the app is first rendered to the screen. But now, if I clear that, if I change my counter, we don't see running again. And keep in mind that with a method, we did see it, but now that's no longer the case. We only see it if we type here, which makes a lot of sense because here we really change something that's being used in that computed property. We change the name with every keystroke. So with computed properties, Vue is aware of the dependencies of the computed properties. So in this case, that name is a dependency, and it will cache the computed property value and only recalculate and reevaluate it if one of the dependencies, in this case the only dependency we have, the name property, changed. And that's the key difference. For performance, it's better to use computed properties than methods for outputting values. In most cases, only use methods if you know that you want to recalculate a value whenever anything on the page changed. In most scenarios, that will not be the case. You only want to recalculate a value if a dependency changed, and that's when computed properties shine. You still need methods, either because you have something that you really want to re-execute whenever anything changed, or more often because you have events and you want to trigger certain methods when an event occurs. That does not change. You still bind your events to methods. You don't bind events to computed properties. You really only use computed properties for outputting something like here, the full name. So now we learned about computed properties, a key feature for outputting dynamic values that depend on multiple input values, or, like in this case here, on one input value and one hard-coded value. There also is another reactivity feature built into Vue, and that would be watchers. Now, what are watchers? Well, a watcher is basically a function you can tell Vue to execute when one of its dependencies changed. Okay, that sounds just like computed properties, doesn't it? Well, indeed you can use watchers instead of computed properties, and here's how that would work and why you maybe don't want to do it. Let me add a full name data property here, like this, and therefore let's comment out this full name computed property so that we don't have a name clash. You don't want to use a computed and a data property with the same name. Now we can add a new configuration here, a new option to this object we passed to create app. Again, anywhere in there, position doesn't matter. I'll add it here. And that's the watch option. Just like data, computed, and methods, this name is not up to you. It's one of the supported features Vue has, and therefore this has to be watch. Watch wants an object, just like computed and methods. And in here, again, you'll define a bunch of methods. To be precise, here, you can now use a name you used in a data or computed property as a name for a watcher method. So for example, here we could use name, because we have that name data property, and define it as a method here in watch. Technically, this is okay. We'll not have any name clashes here. This tells Vue one important thing. Whenever name changes, this watcher method will re-execute. And that's really important. This name here, being used here, sets up this connection. That's how watchers work. You repeat another data or computed property name in a watcher method as a method name there. And when you do that, that watcher method will be executed automatically by Vue whenever a property of that name, so in this case, whenever the name property changes. We could also watch the counter property instead, but here I want to watch the name. And then in here, we can specify any logic we want. We don't return anything because we're not going to use the watcher anywhere in our HTML code to use a returned value. Instead, in here we can run logic that should be executed when the name changed. For example, we could update full name here and set it equal to this.name plus an empty space plus Schwarzmüller. Actually, we don't even need to refer to this.name here. A watcher function automatically gets the last value, the latest value of the watched property as an argument. So this is passed in automatically by Vue, this latest value of the watched property. Hence, we can accept it as an argument, name it however you want, and then use it in here. We actually also could accept a second argument here besides value, and that would then be the previous value. So the old value of the watched property. Here I'm just accepting one because we only need that one, but you could accept two arguments if you wanted to. New value and old value. And with that we would also update the full name whenever the name changes. If we save that and reload, indeed if I type here, you have the same behavior as before. With one difference, we always see Schwarzmüller here, but we could also change this. Check if value is empty is an empty string, and if that's the case, we set full name equal to an empty string as well. So that would be how we could ensure that full name is empty if value is empty. Actually, of course, I should then put the other code into an else block though, and now we have that described behavior. So that's a watcher, and as you see, you could use it as an alternative to a computed property. Now, we have a couple of problems if we use it for that though. For one, I would argue that the concept of a computed property is maybe a bit easier to understand. But the bigger problem arises if we have a computed property that would use more than one dependency. Let's say we have a second input. So I just duplicated my input here, and there we have a last name. Now we add a new data property, last name, which initially is an empty string, and this is bound with vModel on that second input. So now we have these two names. Now we want to update the full name whenever the name or the last name changed. To achieve this with a watcher, we need to add a second watcher, because the first one simply watches the name. Now we need to add a second one where we also watch last name and get the value of that. And in here we have almost the same code, but we want to set the full name here equal to this.name plus blank plus last plus value, because here we get the latest value of last name. And up there in our first watcher, we want to change this to value plus blank plus this last name, because we're watching name here. So now we have two watchers to reflect the full name, which is managed with two inputs. And yes, this works, but it's a lot of code, especially if we compare it to the computed property alternative. Let me comment out the full name data property. And let's also comment out the watchers. We could remove them, but I'll keep them around for reference. And let's bring back the computed property to see how much easier it is with a computed property. There, if we want to use two dependencies, we simply reference two dependencies, like this, pointing at this last name. And now we got the desired behavior with less code. Maybe we should also tweak the if check here and check if the name is empty or this last name is empty. If either of the two is empty, we return an empty full name. But with that, we got the desired behavior, and it's really not a lot of code. It's just this code to get a full name dynamically. Compare that to our two watchers. So why do we have watchers then if we can use them but they're worse? Because this works but is not the main scenario for using watchers. Watchers are powerful if you have a different kind of intent in mind. Let's come back to our counter here. Let's say when the counter exceeds 50, anything like that, we want to reset it. That's the type of task where a watcher shines. We want to change counter when something happens. So we can watch counter and get its latest value to then check if value, so the value of the counter, is greater than 50. And if that's the case, we set this counter equal to 0. That's the kind of thing where watchers can be helpful. If you want to run logic that maybe also updates a data property, but which shouldn't always do that, for example. Here, I only want to set the counter to 0 if we exceed 50. A computed property would probably not be the best alternative here for this kind of task. You can try solving this with a computed property and you'll quickly see that you'll face some problems here. With a watcher, this is easy though. If we save that and now reload, we can change the counter, but you'll see if I press add 10 again, and hence we would exceed 50, it's back to 0 and starts again. So that's the kind of task where a watcher can shine. Another example would be HTTP requests which you want to send if certain data changes, or timers which you want to set if certain values change. For example, here we could say if value exceeds 50, I want to set a timer to 2 seconds, and in the function that executes after the 2 seconds, I want to reset the counter. Like this, that won't work though, because this in here won't refer to the same thing this would refer to outside of this function, and therefore we can work around that by storing this in another constant and using that here. That's nothing view specific, that's just how JavaScript works. The this keyword can be tricky there. But with that code, if I reload, if I ramp up the timer, it goes above 50, but it's reset eventually. Because we set a timeout every time the counter changes and is greater than 50. That's, by the way, also why it resets multiple times here, because if I exceed 50 and I keep on going, I trigger more and more watcher executions and more timers get set. So that's the kind of task where a watcher can be useful. If you want to run some code which maybe, but not necessarily, also updates some data property in reaction to a property changing. If you want to do that, execute code because something changed, then watchers can be helpful. If you just want to calculate some output value dynamically, computed properties are your friend. I know that this methods versus computed versus watchers thing can be very confusing, so it's time for a short summary. Methods can be used in your template to bind data, to use them in an interpolation, for example, to derive data that should be used in the template, or for event binding. You can use methods for both. And if you use them in the data binding use case, so if you use them between curly braces, for example, to outsource logic from the template to your view instance, then the method is executed for every re-render cycle of the component. So whenever something changes and the template is re-evaluated, every method that's called in the template will be called again. That's what I showed you a couple of lectures ago. And therefore, you should use methods primarily for event binding. There, it's a no-brainer. You always use them. Or for data binding, so with double curly braces, for example, if you really want them to re-execute whenever something changes on the page. Otherwise, use computed properties, because those can only be used with data binding. You don't use them with event binding. And computed properties are great to derive data that's based on other data, with the advantage that they will only be re-evaluated and re-executed by view if the dependent data changed. So if the data used inside of the computed property changed, they will not be re-evaluated if some other data changed. And therefore, use them for data that depends on other data. Last but not least, watchers are not directly used in the template. You don't reference them there, but you can watch any property, even computed properties, with them. And that allows you to run code in reaction to some change data. For example, to send a HTTP request, set a timer, store something in local storage, whatever it is. So typically, you should use watchers for any non-data updates you want to make. Whenever you got some behind-the-scenes work to do based on some changing data, you might want to consider a watcher. Amongst the three, watchers are probably the feature you'll use the least, because you need methods all the time with event binding and computed properties for outputting data that depends on other data. So now it's almost time to practice again, but here's one important shorthand, one way of writing a bit shorter code which you should be aware of. Not directly related to computed properties and watchers, but to view in general. We used vOn quite a bit. And before we also used vbind, if you remember. Now vOn and vbind are so common that there are shorthands for them. Instead of using vOnClick, vOn input, and whatever you want to do, you can replace vOn : with an @ symbol. And that's exactly the same thing. It's just a shorthand provided by Vue to make adding event listeners a bit easier. You can still combine this with modifiers and still do everything you did before. You just replace vOn : with @ so that you have less code to write. It's up to you if you want to use that. You just should be consistent. So if you do use it for all events, not just some. And I'm going to use it throughout the course, by the way. But you don't have to, it's just an alternative. We also have a shortcut for vbind. If we had vbind value here, then we can actually also just omit vbind and just have : value for binding an attribute dynamically. So just : attribute name is a shorthand for vbind, attribute name, and @event name is a shortcut for von, event name. Again, it's up to you what you prefer, but you should be consistent, and I'm going to use these shorthands throughout the course. There is no vmodel shorthand, by the way. So, again, were you successful? Let's solve this together. Task number 1 was to connect the buttons and calculate a value, a number, and show not there yet if we're not yet at a result of 37, and show too much if we have a result greater than 37. So, first things first, we need to create a Vue app, of course. And we can store that in a constant, pass in our config object, and of course also mount that app to connect it to our HTML code. Again, here we have an idea of assignment on this section, so I'm going to use that. Now, what do we want to do in that app? We want to listen to these button clicks here, and we certainly want to manage some value which changes with every button click. And then to solve task 1, I would say we want a computed property which shows either not there yet, if the value is too small, the value if it's exactly 37, and too much if it's above 37. So let's add some data first of all, and some methods, because we need methods to react to button clicks, and we need data to manage a counter. So I'll do that. You can name it counter, you can name it count, you can name it number, whatever you want. I'll name it number to mix things up. And I want to change the number on those button clicks. For that, as you learned, we can add click listeners with vOnClick, or using the newly learned shorthand, add click, which I'll use here. And then we could change number in here if we wanted to, or recommended, we use a method instead. Add number is the name I'll choose here. And here I want to set this number equal to this number plus 5, or since we actually will have a +1 button, I will make this a bit more reusable by accepting the number I want to add as a parameter and then using it like this. And then here we can just call add number like this and pass in 5 here and repeat the same on the second button, but pass in 1 here, making this method a bit more flexible and using it in 2 different ways on 2 different buttons. So now we're managing the number, and we could output the number here. With double curly braces in this paragraph, we can output the number, save that and reload, and we would see it here. So that works. But that's not the goal. We don't just want to output the number here, we want to output a result which is either some text or the number. And that screams for a computed property. We could use a method, but for the reasons mentioned throughout the last lectures, methods are not ideal for that. And therefore here I'll add the computed key to my configuration object here. And in there you can now add methods with any name of your choice, and I'll name this result. And in here, I now want to refer to the number we're managing here in our data. And I want to check if this number is smaller than 37, because that was the task. If it's smaller than 37, this computed property will return a value of not there yet. Else if this number is equal to 37, I will return this number. So I will return 37 in the end. Else, and I'm writing this in this very explicit structured way, you could write it with less code, but I want to make it clear what's happening here. That's why I'm writing it like this. So else, if the number is greater than 37, therefore, I return too much. And now we have the result computed property, which depends on our number property, and Vue detects this dependency and will only recalculate and reevaluate result whenever number changes. So here we now don't output number, but instead result. And if we save that and reload, we see not there yet. But if I add 5 a couple of times, we see too much. Now, if I try to get exactly 37, I'll add 5 7 times and 1 twice. And now I reached 37. We see that. But as soon as I go above that, for example, by adding 1 again, we see too much again. And this shows us events, methods, and computed properties in action. And that was task number 1. Now task number 2, and therefore already the last task in this assignment, is to watch for changes in result and reset the value to 0 after 5 seconds. So watch for changes in this result computed property, not in the number, but in result. And when result changes, no matter how it changed, I want to reset the value, so the number here, to 0 after 5 seconds. That is the task here. Now, to achieve that, we need a watcher. Again, you can add that wherever you want, maybe below computed, maybe above it, up to you. And we want to watch result, the result computed property, this one. And yes, we can watch computed properties. We can watch both regular and computed properties. So here, we turn this into a method, but because it's in watch, this tells view that we want to watch a property with the same name. So in this case, this computed property. And whenever that changes, we want to trigger the watcher. And that's really important. Whenever it changes, whenever result has a new value, not whenever result is evaluated. So the watcher here will only execute if result switches from not there yet to a number, or from a number to too much, or from not there yet to too much. So only if the value yielded by result really changed. Only then the watcher executes. Well, and in here we should set a timer with the built-in set timeout function, set it to 5 seconds. And in here, we now want to reset the number. We can do this with this number and set it to 0. If I change that, eventually result should go back to not there yet, because we set the number to 0. But this never happens, because the this keyword in here is unfortunately not pointing at the same thing as outside of the function. So we can use the same trick I showed you before, save this outside of this function in a separate constant and refer to this constant here. Now with that, if I reload, what you'll see is that if I ramp this up so that we have too much, after 5 seconds, we go back to not there yet. And of course, this, by the way, also triggers the watcher again. We can see this if we add a console log statement, watcher executing. If we add that, increase this and open up the developer tools, if I reload, you see initially the watcher does not run, but if I now add 5, we see the watcher executes once we change result. After 5 seconds, it's reset, and then the watcher runs again because we reset the number. This triggers result to return a new value, and that triggers the watcher again. Thereafter, it doesn't run again though, because it just resets this again. This hence gives us not there yet again, which is not a new value, and therefore the watcher is not triggered again. So it's not an infinite loop. But this is the assignment solved, and it hopefully helps you a bit with understanding computed properties, events and methods, and also watchers, and how these things play together and work together, and how they allow us to build highly reactive view applications. At this point, we learned about data binding with interpolation and vbind, about event binding and views reactivity, especially also with features like computed properties or watchers. And these are all core features which you gotta know. I guess that's why they are in this basics section. There's one more basic building block into which I want to dive together with you, and that is styling, to be precise, dynamic styling. and I prepared a basic example for that, which you'll of course find attached to this lecture. With dynamic styling, I mean that in Vue, we can change the style of things on the page, well, dynamically, in reaction to something. For example, in reaction to a click or to the user entering something. Let me show you an example here. Let's first of all create a new app with Vue create app, pass in our object, store it in a constant maybe, and then call mount on our app to mount it to a place in our HTML code, in this case to this section which has the styling ID with hash styling. And now let's say we want to be able to click on those divs and highlight the div which is active. Now one way of doing that, probably not the shortest way, but definitely a way that should be easy to understand, is that we have a data property here, or our data object here in this Vue app, as we did many times before. And in here, we keep track of which div, which demo div is selected. We could do this with box A selected, which we set to false initially, box B selected, and then box C selected. So I'm having 3 data properties with different names, which I will basically mentally connect to those divs. And initially they're all set to false because initially, let's say, no div is selected. Now let's add a click listener. We can not just add click listeners to buttons. We can listen to clicks on basically any HTML element. And I'll add a method in my methods object, therefore, which I want to fire when this div is clicked. I'll name it box selected, and actually I want to get the box, so an identifier for which box was selected as an input, and then here I'll check if box is equal to, let's say, A, and if that's the case, I'll set this box A selected to true, else if box is, let's say, B, I'll set this box B selected to true, and else if box is C, I'll set this box C selected to true. So these are the options we have here. And now on the click listener, I want to point at box selected, or to be precise, I'll use this alternative syntax of executing it myself by adding parentheses so that I can pass in A as a string as a value for this first div, and then repeat this on the other divs so that we have an easy way of using one and the same method for setting different boxes to selected. Currently, by the way, there is no way of unselecting them, but for the moment, that's all I need. So now we have ways of changing these data properties through clicks, but I mentioned that I want to dive into styling with you. Well, let's say we want to highlight when a box is selected. And we can do that with Vue. Let's say we want to change the border color of a box if it is selected. So of this first box, for example. Well, we can set styles either through CSS and CSS classes, or also with inline styles by using the style attribute, which is available on basically any HTML element. In there, you can do things like this: border color red. If I save that, we have a red color here on the first box, but of course this now always applies, not just sometimes. Well, we just need to bind style to a dynamic value, and we can do this with vbind or the shorthand just :style. But now here's a special thing. Style and also class, as you will see in a couple of minutes, are different. If you bind those dynamically with vbind, you can actually use a special syntax supported by Vue for these specific attributes, so for style and for class. You can now feed in an object here, which style normally does not want, but you can use it because that's a special Vue feature for style and class. And in there, you can have your CSS property name, border color, however, either wrapped between single quotes, because we have a JavaScript object here, and property names with dashes are not allowed there. So we either need quotes, or, recommended and better, use the camel case version of that, where you omit the dash, and the character after the dash simply is a capital character now. And then you could set this to red here, for example, or to make it really dynamic, check if box A is selected. So if this data property here is true, and use a ternary expression to check if that is truthy, so if it's true, and if that's the case, after the question mark, we set this to red. Otherwise, we set it to this gray color, so to this hex code. And that's a default ternary expression in JavaScript, which we can use here since we're binding this dynamically. This object syntax is a special feature supported by Vue for the style attribute specifically. And if I now saved it and reload, we initially have this gray border color, but if I click on this box, it gets red. Now there's no way of turning it back to gray at the moment because we have no way of making it unselected, but that's not a problem here because I want to focus on the dynamic styling, and that is how you could set up styles dynamically with Vue, vbind, and this special style binding syntax. It's practice time again. Again, I got a little assignment for you. Attached you find this starting setup where I want you to practice with computed properties and watchers. And for that you got this very simple setup with two buttons, add 5 and add 1. And in your first task, I want you to connect those buttons to a Vue instance, to methods in that Vue instance in the end, to calculate a number to which you simply add 5 or 1. And you can simply start at 0 and then build up a bigger number over time, every time you click the button. Now here you got a paragraph where you want to show a result, but the special thing is that you should not show the calculated number here, but instead show a derived property which is based on that calculated number, and simply show a text of not there yet if the number is smaller than 37. Show a value of too much if it's bigger than 37, and show the number itself if it is exactly 37. So you only show the calculated number if it's exactly 37, otherwise you show that, and you can use the reactivity tools I taught you over the last lectures to achieve this. The second task is that you should then watch for changes in result, and basically reset the value to 0 after 5 seconds whenever result changed. So whenever result changed, you want to reset the value after 5 seconds. That's the idea here. So that is your task, or these are your tasks. Definitely compare your solution to mine, or have a look at my solution if you're not able to solve this, but also definitely try it on your own first. Now, binding inline styles dynamically, as we're doing it here, works, but inline styles have a couple of disadvantages. They overrule all other styles, which sometimes is what you'll need, but often leads to problems. Therefore, in modern web development and CSS, we typically don't use inline styles too often. So let's actually get rid of that, and let me instead show you something else. How we can bind CSS classes dynamically, because that's an alternative approach we could use here. Let's for a moment go to styles CSS, and let's add a new CSS class here, a new CSS class selector. I'll name it active, but you can use any name you want. And the only rule or the only property I'll style in there is border color, which I set to red. Well, actually, to make it even easier to see, let me also change the background color to salmon. But this is optional. So now we have this active CSS class here in the CSS file, which we can now close. And now let's say we want to add this class dynamically to this div if box A selected is true. So therefore, of course, we can bind the class attribute dynamically with vbind or this shorthand with just :class. Now, class, of course, needs a string now, the name of the class that should be added. For example, demo, which is responsible for this default box style. That's why I'm passing in a string here. But we could now make sure that we pass more than just that string if indeed box A is selected. So if box A selected here is true. And for that, we could again check box A selected. So check this property in a ternary expression. We can use JavaScript here now because we're binding this with vbind. Check if that's truthy, and if it is, we add demo and active. And this needs to be a string because this is all evaluated as JavaScript here, and we want to return a string with these classes to class if that is selected. Else, in this ternary expression, we'll just add demo. So that active is only added if box A selected is true. And if I reload, this works. However, this is not the nicest code. It's a bit hard to read. And imagine how difficult this would be to read if we had more classes that we want to toggle dynamically. Thankfully, just as with style, Vue.js supports a special syntax, especially for the class attribute as well, if you're binding it with vbind. You can pass an object here as well, which normally would not work. If you don't bind it, that does not make any sense. But if you do bind it, Vue supports this object syntax, and in there you can now add properties where the property names reflect your CSS classes, and the values of those properties are true or false, or a truthy or falsy result that indicates whether that class should be added. So we could add demo as a key name, as a property name, and set it to true so that demo is always added, and add active and set the value of active to box A selected so that the active class is added to this div if box A selected is truthy. And if we save that and reload, we get the same behavior as before, but with much more readable code. Especially if we add more and more classes here, this stays readable and stays maintainable, which of course is super important. And now we could do the same on the other divs as well. But actually, before we do that, I want to simplify that even more. Setting demo to true is a bit redundant. We always add that class. So therefore, thankfully, we can remove it from here, remove it from this object, and instead add the class attribute like this and set it to demo, and have our dynamically bound class attribute in addition. So this one here is not dynamically bound. I'm not having a colon here. So that's the regular class attribute. And I'll set it to demo. And Vue will basically just recognize that and never change it. But then I also bind class dynamically. And what Vue will do is it will evaluate the result of this dynamic class binding and merge it with the hard-coded one here. With that, if I reload, we get the same behavior as before, but with even less code, or even easier to manage code, I should say. Well, and of course now we can easily bring that over to the other divs as well, if we want to, and just check for box B selected and box C selected. And with that, we can highlight those boxes as well. We cannot unmark them at the moment, but still, this is how you can add dynamic classes and dynamic styling with Vue. Now, if we want to make sure that users can actually toggle this and not just mark it as active, we can simply go to our code and change this a little bit. And instead of setting this box A selected to true all the time, I'll set it to the opposite of this box A selected. So that in the end, if box A was selected, if it was true, it's now false, thanks to this exclamation mark. And this false value is the new value for box A selected. And I'll do the same for the other boxes. And with this simple adjustment, we ensure that this now is toggleable, that we can toggle this and not just set it as active, but also set it as inactive. Now you can also utilize computed properties here if you want, because I mentioned having logic in the HTML code is suboptimal. Now for this class binding it actually is okay, but if you want to move this logic here out of the HTML code, well, you can simply add computed properties here in your view config object by adding the computed key, and in there any name of your choice like box A classes, because here I want to derive the classes that should be added to box A, and then simply put this logic, this logic here, which I'm binding to my first box, in here and return it here. Return this object in box A classes and then bind class here to box A classes, just like that. If I reload, it crashes because of course this now should be this box A selected here since I'm now inside of my view app. But now if I reload, this works just as before with a computed property. This can especially be helpful if you have more complex dynamic class code. If you're not just referring to a true or false boolean here, but if you had a more complex check or different if statements here where you want to return different objects. In such cases, as always, computed properties can shine a lot, but you can also use it here to simplify your HTML code a bit more and move that logic into JavaScript. It's optional here though, you can do it, but for styling, for dynamic styling, it's definitely not a must do unless you have very complex code for finding out whether a class should be added or not. There's one more syntax supported by Vue, which I don't want to hide from you. You can have multiple class attributes like this, but if you have multiple class assignments, you can also just work with one dynamic class assignment where you, for example, have this object syntax, but not pass in the object like this, but instead pass an array where your object, where you configure which class should be added, could be one element in the array. And other elements could be, for example, demo as a string. So with that, you can also add multiple potentially dynamically derived classes to one and the same div by using this array syntax, which also works just fine. That's just another syntax to be aware of. You have multiple options here, and it of course depends on your personal preferences and also on what you're building, which option you want to go with. But that is dynamic styling and what you can do regarding that in Vue. Obviously, super powerful and super important, as you will also see throughout this course and the different projects we're going to build, because with dynamic styling, you can really build amazing user interfaces. So that's it for the module. And this was a huge course section, of course, since we covered all the important fundamentals you need to know about Vue. We learned how interacting with the DOM works and how Vue manages templates to allow you to use certain Vue features which are then reflected on the actual page. You learned that Vue has this core idea of letting you define the goal rather than the individual steps, so that it follows that declarative approach where you define how your page should look like and which parts on the page might be dynamic, and you let then Vue figure out how to get there. Now, in order to let Vue do its job, you need to connect your Vue app, your Vue instance, to the actual HTML code with the mount method which you saw. Then you can use a CSS selector to select a part of the page and turn that part into the template of the Vue app, in which you then can use all these Vue features, like for example, the data and event binding features you learned about. You learned that data can be output in that template, so in the controlled HTML code, by using the double curly brace syntax for this interpolation syntax to just output some text, which might change over time in a certain place of the page, or with the vbind directive to bind HTML attributes to some dynamic value. You also learned about this shorthand notation where instead of vbind : some attribute, you just have : some attribute to then bind that attribute to a dynamic value. And we of course cannot just output data, we can also listen to events with the von directive or the @ shorthand notation. Now these are the powerful core features Vue is all about, but in order to make these features really powerful and to make them more useful, we rely on Vue's built-in reactivity system. That simply means that Vue will update the real DOM whenever some data which you're outputting with vbind or double curly braces changes. And you learned that you can register data which might change in the data option of your Vue app, and that you can also work with computed properties and watchers to calculate results dynamically or to run some code whenever some data changes. And Vue watches the data for you, it automatically detects changes for you, and it will update the DOM and therefore what the user sees on the page whenever such changes are detected. Now that's the important foundation you need when working with Vue. But it's of course not just about outputting text or data. In web apps, we also of course want to make them look pretty, and that involves styling. And here, Vue also can help us with achieving dynamic styling, because we can of course also set CSS classes or inline styles dynamically with vbind. And you also learned that Vue has special syntaxes for classes and inline styles to help you assign dynamic styles, to make that easier for you with that object or array syntax I covered over the last lectures. Now, that's the foundation. It's of course not all you need to know, but it's the foundation for the rest of the course. And you will see the concepts taught in this course section throughout all other course sections. So make sure you understand this, go through the lectures which might not be clear to you at this point, and do the challenges and exercises I offer to you in the section so that you really know what these core concepts are all about. So one last time for this module, it's time to practice what you learned. Here's another assignment. Of course, you find this assignment code attached to this lecture. We're going to practice working with dynamic styles now. Over the last lectures, you learned how to work with them. Now it's your turn to apply your knowledge on your own. In task number 1, I want you to fetch user input from this input field, for example with vModel, and store it in some data property, for example, to then use that entered value to add CSS classes to this paragraph conditionally. There are 2 classes available which you can enter, user1 and user2, because those classes are predefined here in styles CSS. Of course, you could also add your own ones if you wanted to, but these 2 already exist. And whenever the user enters user1 in this input, that user1 class should be added to the paragraph. Whenever the user enters user2, that class should be used instead. Maybe also experiment with different ways of solving this, because there will be more than one possible way of achieving this. The next task then still is related to this paragraph, but now also to this button. There are 2 classes, CSS classes in style CSS, hidden and visible. And you should switch between those classes with that button. When the button is pressed, you basically want to control some isVisible data point, which then in turn is responsible for adding the visible or the hidden CSS class to this paragraph. So you should switch between these classes and therefore hide or show the paragraph. In the third task, we're going away from dynamic classes and will instead work with dynamic inline styles. The user should be able to enter a color here in this input, and that should then be used as a background color on this paragraph, set with dynamic inline styling though. Not with classes, but with dynamic inline styling. As always, take my solution and compare yours against it, both my solution code as well as the video, in case you're stuck, but also try it on your own first. So, as always, were you successful with that? Let's solve this together. First of all, we need to create a Vue app, of course, where we pass in our config object, which we store in a constant or variable, and then we mount that to our assignment here, to this assignment section, selecting by that ID. And now the first task was to fetch the user input and use the input as a CSS class that's added to this paragraph. And the available classes are user1 and user2 because these are the classes I predefined in the styled CSS file. Of course, you could add more classes if you want to. To achieve that, I will first of all add my data option here to this configuration object. And in here, I want to store the user input. I'll name it input class, but the name is up to you. So here I want to store whatever the user enters into this input, and to easily get access to that, I'll use vModel. I don't really need two-way binding here, but it's just very easy to, well, get and store the user input with it, and therefore, well, I'll use it. As an alternative, you could of course use vOn or at input, and then manually extract what the user entered and store that in the input class data property. But vModel is simply a bit quicker here. So with that, I have the user input. And now to set this as a class here on this paragraph, I want to bind class dynamically. And we can start super simple. I don't need that object syntax here. Instead, I can simply bind it to input class. And now whatever the user enters will be added as a CSS class to this paragraph. It's as simple as that. So if I reload, I can type anything I want, and it will have no effect because no class of that name was defined in the CSS file. But if I enter user 1, we see a different style. And if I enter user 2, we also see a different style. But whatever I enter is added as a class. And you can confirm this by inspecting the paragraph, of course. You see now my strange input is added as a class. So every keystroke updates the class, but only user 1 and user 2 are actually classes that are also defined in the CSS file. Now, if you don't want to do this on every keystroke, if you don't want to add any input as a class, you can of course alternatively use the object syntax and add the user1 class if input class, so whatever the user entered and what's stored in this input property, if that's equal to user 1, and do the same for a user 2. This is a bit more code, but it makes sure that we only add user 1 or user 2 as classes and not any input. You can of course also put this into a computed property to get that long code out of the HTML code into JavaScript. But this is optional. I just want to show the different alternatives here so that you are aware of them. But with that, that's task 1 already solved. Now move on to task 2. There we have the toggle paragraph button, and we want to use the visible and hidden classes, which are defined here in the CSS file, to show or hide the above paragraph, so this paragraph. So we want to add hidden or visible. Clicking the button should toggle between those two options. So how could we implement that? Of course, we'll need a click listener because we want to do something when the button is clicked. And then we could add a new data property, paragraph is visible, for example, which initially is true, let's say. And we want to change this property upon every click. So we can add a method here, which we could name toggle paragraph visibility, but the name is totally up to you. And in here, I'll set this paragraph is visible to what it's currently not, by using that same trick I showed you before. I invert the value so that if that was true, it's now false. If it was false, it's now true. Now I point at this method here on my click listener, and with that we are changing this value. Now we can use that value to add our hidden or visible classes to this paragraph. So I'm going to add even more classes, and that's now definitely the point of time where I will remove that from HTML and instead add a computed property to keep the HTML code short and readable. Now here in this computed property, I'll name it para classes. Name is up to you, of course. And I return this object here. Important, now input class needs to be accessed on this because we're now in the view instance. Let me reformat that to make it easier to read. And now I also want to add the visible class. If this paragraph is visible, is true, but this is a redundant check since true or false is the required value here for this visible value. For this visible property, we can just point at it. And we want to add the hidden class if not this paragraph is visible. So if this is false. And now we can assign para classes to this dynamically bound class. With that, if we reload, if I click toggle paragraph, it's gone. If I click it again, it's back again. So this now works. And now we got task number 2 solved. Task number 3 uses inline styling, which I mentioned you wouldn't use too often, but of course you should still be aware of how to use it. And essentially here, I want to make sure that the user is able to enter a background color, so either a hex code or one of the built-in colors like red and blue, and I want to set this as a background color to this paragraph. Now for that, again, we can add a new data property. Input background color could be a fitting name. And I want to set the style on the paragraph dynamically. Hence, I'll use vbind or the shorthand, just a colon, on the style attribute to pass in an object here and set background color, since it's a word with a dash, using this camel case notation where we omit the dash and instead capitalize the first character after the dash, and set this equal to input background color, so to this data property. And now we simply bind this with vmodel again to save some time to that input here. So input background color. Now with every keystroke, whatever the user enters as a color is saved here in input background color. And we're then setting this as a color for the CSS background color property as a style on this paragraph. So if we now reload, if I set this to red, we got a red background. We can also go for orange or blue, or also use some hex code. That all works, and that's the styling assignment done. I hope you got a lot out of that, and with that, you're now prepared to make your next steps deeper into Vue land.